nothing better, doing something better than nothing. I think that do no harm is very important for the peace building and peace post-conflict period. And if we look at the PCNA, post-conflict needs assessment, always we must be aware of the do no harm. That's my response to that question.
But what does that mean then? I think that's something everyone can agree on. Do no harm first, the rule of physicians. But what does it in fact mean? Does it mean not interfering because you're afraid of doing harm? Or does it mean doing something even if there are potential consequences? I mean, I think one of the problems with Gerard Prunier's approach is it's fine to say don't do anything, but if that means that so it's harder to do that when people are suffering. I'm just not sure.
I mean, do no harm doesn't mean don't do anything. We do something, but we must be aware of the consequence of what we do.
Yes.
Can I just jump in on that one? I mean, I think do no harm, taken strictly, does suggest the best way of doing that is to do nothing. You're not doing any harm if you're not doing anything. I think it should really be modified to say do no net harm, because there will always be negative consequences to what one does. And so the overall impact should be positive. But I think to take that strictly, this from the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm, can be perilous. Can I follow?
Yep.
I have one question to address to Vladimir and another one to Ian. The Arab Spring, why is it that the contagion of the Arab Spring did not reach Khartoum? And then a question for Ian. I wonder whether your iconoclastic performance, whether it targeted a particularly ideal form of peace building, that is one that tries to at the same time be just. And I think there are times when justice and peace, the aims of justice and peace, are in conflict with each other, when in fact, in order to get peace, one has to make concessions to the powerful, which then often ends up being a violation of justice, and that a pragmatic approach to peace building, in fact, will at times make compromises with the notion of justice that often is built into peace building.
Thank you very much for the question, Professor. Myself, I'm trying to understand exactly what might be the right answer to your question, why it is not. Why is it so that the contagion of the Arab Spring did not reach Khartoum, Sudan? I see it in the following terms. Number one, I'm doing my best to avoid falling a victim of journalistic stereotypes. What does it mean, Arab Spring? What actually we're talking about? As a politologist, one has to assess the situation slightly differently from those who inform us about the developments in Egypt or Libya or Tunisia through mass media. And if we assess the situation in that sense, in Syria and then go down to places like Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on, we will see quite significant differences in the situation on the ground, the effect that the mass media, the social networks may have on the population. Sudan obviously is very much different from that, and you cannot compare the situation in the Sudan with that of Egypt for thousands of obvious reasons. The type of the state, the quality of the leadership, the history of relations within the country, and so on. So I would say that we have simply to remember, and that is something what today nobody is talking about. Our Egyptian participants will definitely recollect that in history of Sudan, since independence, there were two instances, long before internet appeared and social networks appeared, when the two leaders, General Daoud and General Field Marshal Nimeiri, left their positions because of the mass protest, which was not at all violent. Simply, the center of Khartoum was filled with 2 million of its population, who demanded for 2 or in the second case for 3 days that the president would leave, and they did. They left. So what I'm trying to say is that the society must be prepared for this kind of change of power, to a point where it is able to risk its own life and its own well-being by going into the street and demanding the change of power. Sudan is not there yet, just not there yet. And as we know very well, there is no such phenomenon as contagion in politics when we're talking about separate countries. Each country has to be ripe to come to a point where it will have a fundamental change. I would go and use the pattern that Professor William Zartman once used, that neither of the parties yet in Sudan, in the north, is in a position of mutual head to a point where change is inevitable. They are not mutually heading to that point. They may be coming there, as was the case with Egypt, which was every year there were predictions Mubarak is going to fail. Every year since 20 years back at least. And he has collapsed only 2 years ago. What is going to happen in Khartoum, I don't know. Maybe tomorrow, no. Maybe next year, yes, who knows? But it is not there yet.
Is this a follow-up on that before Ian responds? Yes. It's a follow-up on this question.
Exactly.
Please.
In fact, Sudanese were the pioneer of the kind of revolution that started in North Africa. They did it once in 1964, sorry. I remember I was at school, and for about a week, almost the whole population of Khartoum were in the streets, defying a formidable force of General Abud at that time. And the main problem in both cases, the other one I'm going to mention later, was the problem of Southern Sudan. That was an issue. So the Sudanese revolted in 1950, years before the Arabs. And they did it again against Nimeiri in 1985. And also almost for the same reasons. But unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood took the opportunity to establish themselves in an unfortunate way anyway. So why do Sudanese not do the same thing as the Tunisians, the Libyans, the Egyptians, and now the, you can say, the Yemeni and the Syrians? I think personally, I think there is a simple interpretation to that, that Sudanese are tired of making a kind of revolution that ends up bringing people who are worse than the people before. And also the opposition members of kind of opposition parties or, can I say, groupings, whether it is Sadiq al-Mahdi's Ummah party or the affiliates or the Mermani, they are now allies of the current power. And they decided probably that they are too old now to do anything. They decided just to take advantage of the situation. Many of their young people, young sons, or daughters are involved in the current government. So they adopted the politics of if you cannot beat them, join them. And they did. So Sudanese are asking themselves still, what would be the outcome of any revolution that we make? And they want to make sure, I'm sure, that they want to make sure that this time it should be different than the two previous times. That's, I think, my interpretation.
Thank you. Ian?
I was actually wondering, Peter, can you just put that as a question more directly for me?
Oh, okay. I think much of the peace-building literature has been idealistic. I agree with you on that score. And but the crucial element of the idealism was that it has to be peace with justice.
Yes.
But very often, in fact, there is tension between peace and justice, because in order to get peace, you often have to make concessions to the powerful, which violates justice.
Yes.
And so my question really is, do you have to be as pessimistic about peace building if you take a more pragmatic approach where you at times make compromises with respect to the ideal of justice? So it's a very theoretical question. But,
that's okay with me. Well, my first response is to say I recognize that I tend to be more pessimistic, more critical. I even said that at the beginning. I'm not saying that we should do nothing. I'm also not saying that I want to be careful that not to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that war is good. I think that argument is that if we all agree that peace is the outcome, how are you going to get there sooner? So I think people like Prunier, there's another guy, Edward Lutvak, or someone said a mischievous article, "Give War a Chance." His argument is that by sustaining, by assuming that people will eventually, that people want peace and that they'll eventually get there as long as you create the conditions for them to negotiate, that sometimes just sustains the conflictual relationship, and that's not good. Better to let one side win and establish authority. I think it's. I don't know what the answer is. I think that it's always going to be, I think, about compromises. Personally, I have doubts, and I've written this in an article. And this is maybe the darkest outlook. I have doubts about whether African states can ever be peaceful and viable, given their often gigantic size, their extraordinary weakness in terms of institutional ability, their enormous diversity religiously, ethnically. I think any time that you draw a line around...
We'll be talking about India now.
Yes?
Which is a viable state.
Well, some people, things I keep on reading are people saying it's not as viable as you think it is. But we can argue about that. And it's also, there are states in Africa that are better than others. Botswana is the one that continues to be cited. I don't think there is a single solution. I think it probably does involve compromises. Of course, the place I know best is Ethiopia, and I am constantly engaged in debates or hearing debates amongst Ethiopians about whether or not the current ethnic federalism is a conspiracy to keep the Tigrayans in power, a minority, or whether in fact it is Ethiopians who have finally recognized almost more than anyone else a way to have a viable state where people are ruling themselves. So is the Ethiopian model an acceptable compromise? In many perspectives, I think from many perspectives it is. But I don't know. The problem is, I think, whenever you're talking about these situations, it is always desirable to pursue the ideal. And that any sort of compromise is regarded as undesirable. Anything that compromises democratization, anything that compromises people ruling themselves. I mean, I'd like to think that my job here, in terms of my own work, or generally, is not to be iconoclastic as much as just to be questioning and to be constantly critical, and then to have people defend themselves, because I feel like too often this literature is too uncritical. I don't know if that's satisfying answer.
Just one comment to
Yes.
to support the professor.
No, not to question what he said. I want just to have some clarification about your vision for Africa, saying that you have doubts that the African states will ever develop, a sustainable democracy.
As they are currently constructed.
But this, okay, let me react to that. Let us not forget that even in Europe, there are countries who went through dictatorship. Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey, and Egypt. And no continent is immune to this kind of dictatorship. Let me say that. But to predict that the African state might never come out of this mess they are in, I think it is a little bit audacious.
I'm happy to be wrong. I'm not saying that, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that this is my wish for Africa. I'm worried that it seems to me that there is no African state that is invulnerable to these kinds of challenges. The idea, as I think Vladimir put it, that the failure to manage diversity, I don't think that is, I think that's a challenge that faces all African governments. I don't necessarily mean, my view is not that African governments are necessarily, in fact, sometimes I get myself into trouble for giving African governments the benefit of the doubt. I think that, in fact, they, for the most part, do a pretty good job of managing diversity. The problem is the way they do it is through clientelism. And from an outsider's perspective, that is undesirable. But I would say, given that most African governments aren't engaging in massive civil war, they find ways of coping. I think, I put it the other way. I think that African governments do an amazing job of dealing with the fact that they live in these extraordinarily large territories that are diverse and that are institutionally weak. So I think when people get left out, they challenge to get brought back in.
I want to use an example of Europe in trying to defend the governments in Africa. Naturally, as a European, I know a little bit more about Europe than others. At the same time, I love Africa. I worked on Africa for 22 years, starting from Southern African Republic. I have to start with an important thing. I'm totally pro-peace because I am from a country which lost 1/4 of its population in the Second World War. I come from Belarus. Very few people know about it. When you talk normally, they just do not relate that phenomenon. We lost 1 person in 4 during the Second World War. Mostly men who fighting age because of the massive resistance to the German occupation. We lost 70% of national wealth in that war. 70% of that was lost. And when today you talk to anybody in my country. Absolutely anybody who was of my generation and older, they will tell you anything, but not war. So for me, there's no an argument what is better, peace or war. I think it's more theoretical construct than a practical, political human matter. Everybody naturally seeks for peace because we want well-being and prosperity for our family, for our home, for our country, and so on. So peace is a natural desire of a human being, no matter how violent we were in the past, but before we climb down the trees. So in Africa, when you talk to people, obviously you will have the same kind of answer. 99 out of 100 will tell you they want peace without thinking much about it. And for me, this is the main imperative for the politicians to follow. They must do their best in order to make sure there's peace. The question, of course, is whether they follow or not, and we know they are not, because we have here an important thing of access to resources and power that distorts human behavior quite often in a very negative sense. So peace is for me, ultimate objective, and whenever we're talking about assistance to people, IDPs in Sudan, and the Sudan, that's where you come from the assumption that peace is important for them to live decent life, honorable lives. Now, in Africa, you can find at least a dozen of states who have proven they could be stable and developing well within the period of time since their independence. And you will find, of course, number of states which were unable to govern themselves without violence in a consistently improving manner. But where on earth do we have such a place where there were no failed states, no failed government, there were no corrupt political elites, there was no violence as means of resolving internal and international matters. In Europe, there's absolutely not a single country which didn't go through this or that type of a civil war. Not a single. When you start thinking, from Greece to Ireland, from Finland to Portugal, everywhere at some point in their history there was a civil war, or civil wars, and even many civil wars. In Russia in 1918 to 1922, roughly about 10% of the population was lost in the civil war. Horrible civil war. Nothing of a kind has happened anywhere else but Rwanda and Yugoslavia since then, in terms of proportions and impact on its history. Not even Sudan. Not even Sudan. Sorry for saying so. Now, so the point again is here that we must give peace a chance, and if we can do it through provision of humanitarian assistance to the suffering population, we must do it. It should be our imperative in terms of behavior. Unless we follow this kind of principle, how can we actually, as a matter of principle, to go to any place in Africa and say we want to help? We wouldn't have a moral ground to say so, unless we accept peace as an only alternative and support and help to the people who suffer as the paramount principle. So I believe if we formulate our discussion in those terms, then we may come with productive suggestions and policy approaches.
I see a couple of hands. I'm also worried about the fact that we've gone over our health break. But I think since James isn't here, I'll allow questions to go 1, 2, and 3. Yes.
In part, I think I would like to agree with Professor Ian on because I'm not optimistic, but I'm not hopeless. Because what I saw myself is not. I'm not talking about what other people saw, but what I saw myself gives me a sense of being rewarded, I would say. Because when you hold authority over people, and you have a narrow view of how to let them have freedom and even development and even choices, you come and say, what is something? So So with my brother here, of course, there has to be a good reason for people to say, well, there is a lot of despair here. And I understand that because I was in South Sudan last year. And I went to where I was born. And what the man said before, that is still a stone age. It can never come closer to any village here in still a stone age because people are still going. They don't have clothes on. That's the definition of the stone age. So that's a problem. But what I see is, and what I would suggest is how if we see a little room, give people a chance to at least get, like, South Sudanese and Sudanese who are here, of course they can read and write. And if this one is the transmission of this video, literacy, that's going to be the ultimate change, so that everybody knows. Because if I go there, well, whether I die or live, I will not accept these kinds of somebody come and tampering on my rights. I will stand. But people in the villages there, what do they know? So that's the basic. Whether there is money there, of course you can't develop economy without people knowing what is it. So literacy and education, that's one thing that will, in many ways, go into the life of people there, particularly women and young people. So if women are literate, I think change is imminent in many ways. So I think let's talk about all these politics, but let's see the side. How do we are not going to do it right away, but it will take years. And the professor is right. So how long is it going to take? Who knows? So I will not exactly say it is not right. It is not. But that's not the ultimate destiny of Africa, because change will come at some point. So that's what I want.
Thank you. Just two quick comments, and then I think we'll have to break.
Sure. So, Ian, I do share some of your pessimism and appreciate your really thought-provoking questions. You gave us a lot to think about. However, I feel the generalization about African states. I think
So you fear which?
the generalization when we talk about African states or Africa, as like it's a large continent. It has its own kind of peculiar circumstances. True, they share the colonial legacies. They share the kind of disappointing post-colonial failures and all of that. But there are very peculiar circumstances that distinguish, even within each single country in Africa. And that may be a longer discussion that we could have. But yes, I was struggling with the generalization. Not each single African state is in conflict or in disarray. So that's kind of one component. The international factor, when we talk about the Arab Springs, that's another really important component. It is true what Ibrahim said about the history of uprisings in Sudan in the past, but even during the time when people were demonstrating on the streets, there were many Sudanese who were killed and who demonstrated for days. But I don't think Mubarak would have left power without the pressure of the US and other European countries. And that's true for Gaddafi and other areas. But the international community was not, for some reason, willing to push and support some of these uprisings in Sudan. And maybe there is a Sudan fatigue, generally speaking. But the international factor was an instrumental factor in the way that many of these uprisings turned out to be. And it wasn't the case in terms of Sudan. While I'm talking about the international factor, we're talking about the security sector reforms and how do you prioritize. And again, the international community usually prioritizes the DDR as an immediate kind of solution to conflicts. And they do not prioritize justice. Like, on the contrary, they give immunity to those who committed crimes in order to demilitarize and go through the DDR process. And we end up with those who were who committed all kind of heinous crimes being in town. And from a gender perspective, that is a kind of very problematic kind of solution, because women are forced to live side by side of those who raped them and who killed them and who did all kind of inhumane and injustice practices. But the international community is yet, and the UN, International Center for Transitional Justice, all those who have been working around justice issues and reconciliation issues have not figured that formula, and it failed globally speaking. So there are so many other kind of factors besides the local peculiar situations in either Sudan or South Sudan.
Very, very short.
Yes, I'll be very short. Yeah, I just want to emphasize the fact that in these different components of peace building that you have alluded to, that there is a need really for the interconnectedness of these different components that we really do, and it happened in Somalia. I always try to give it, Somalia as an example. We look at these different components separately. In other words, we deal with each other, not really looking into account the interconnectedness that there is between these different components. Like when you talk about justice and reconciliation, we don't look at actually at the SSR, the security sector reform. That's one point. The other point is that yes, I agree with you that it has that peace building actually has to be a bottom-up, to use a bottom-up approach. But in reality, we don't. You see, it's, you need money, and the funders would insist on a top-down approach. In other words, the Americans and the British, and maybe as the Canadians would insist, that we resort to a bottom-up approach, and also resort to quick fixes. Because if it's if the policy of the United States, for instance, is based on counter-terrorism policies, counter-terrorism, then they have to make sure that things are actually solved as soon as possible, otherwise they can have an impact on them. So it's, and that's the reason why, for instance, when they talk about the SSR, what they really focus on is the short-term symptoms of insecurity, rather than thinking in terms of a lasting sort of solution as far as security is concerned, because it's very linked to their own interests. And the other reasons why it can actually be a local process is because you really need institutions to be able to deal with these issues. In the absence of the capacity, then you resort to the United Nations. That's the reason why we have Plenary, and resort also to international NGOs and so on to come and help you. For instance, this is now the provisional constitution of Somalia. It was prepared by the NDI, National Democratic Institute. Couldn't even produce this. So lack of expertise, lack of capacity will compel you to resort to organizations like NDI and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think maybe our last speaker has arrived, but I think it's too late to incorporate anything. One thing that we didn't mention, I didn't mention in all of this too, is the creation in 2005 of the Peace Building Commission, which has a staff and a fund of its own too as well. But as far as I know, I don't think the South Sudan or Sudan have been embraced or put on its agenda. But I appreciate the comments and thank the two speakers. And I think we now will have a health break. Is that right?